G'day, welcome back to the channel. Hey, if you're still chucking out your yeast after every single batch of beer, I've got to ask you the question, mate, what are you doing? You're just throwing good hard-earned cash down the drain. It's easier to reuse yeast than you think. And if you keep it clean and safe, you'll end up with better and better beer over time. Today, I'll walk you through the whole process, save your yeast, save your beer, and also save you a bit of that hard-earned cash too. Here's the TLDR version for those of you that don't like to stick around. Good, you're still with me. Let's break it down properly, step by step, and talk about why it matters if you want to brew consistently good beer. So, remember a couple of weeks ago, you might not, if you haven't seen the video, I'll link to it up here somewhere. We built our closed loop transfer hoses, and we're going to use them in anger today to transfer the Anzac biscuit ale from the primary to the secondary. I'll show you what's going on over in the fridge. So there's our Anzac biscuit ale. And you can see that the krausen's dropped. Got a wrap pill in there, conveniently. Well, what's been happening is I've got our gas line hooked up here, and it's going down all the way to our secondary. The gas line comes down into the beer line, and that's allowed CO2 to purge this all rounder here, and it's come up and it comes out here at the spunning valve. So I've used the CO2 produced from this fermentation to purge the second all rounder. So the plan is to hook up our closed loop transfer hoses onto this primary fermenter, and we'll move it into the lower fermenter with that closed loop with no CO2 to push it. Now, in this bottom fermenter here is our coconut that we toasted, as well as our 200 grams of golden syrup. Let's hook it up and get it going. So we'll come in and we'll hook up our liquid line and our gas line, and we'll get rid of our spunning valve, and we'll come in and hook up our gas line. And now we're going to purge this beer line into our jug. And then we're going to come in and hook up our beer line. So we should end up with something that looks like that. And in order to start the beer flowing into the bottom fermenter, we just simply make a pressure difference, and the beer will flow into this fermenter because we've just started the siphon. There we go, that's our transfer complete. So you can see there's a yeast cake left in this all-rounder, and all of our beer is now down in this one. I've just got to change that wrap pill over on the fermentation chamber, and we'll be good to go. So I've just sorted out everything we're going to need for today. So I've got 5% bleach, so that's 7.5 mils roughly of just normal cheapy bleach from Woolies in 500 mils of water, and we're going to use that as a sanitising spray for all our surfaces later on. Some egg rings that I pinched out of the second drawer in the kitchen. Our mason jars, now these are the 300 ml mason jars. They're Kilner brand. I really like them. They're a good brand. Now they're about $7 or $8 each. Can you use normal spaghetti jars? Yeah, you can. I like these ones. They seem to hold up really well. These ones are about 6 or 7 years old, minus the lids. You can just buy replacement lids. They're a couple of bucks for a dozen. I've got a set of lifting tongs. If you've ever tried lifting a hot jar, you'll thank me later. Nothing's more awkward than trying to lift them out with a tea towel. I've also got a trivet for them to sit on, and our pressure cooker. Now, if you've never used a pressure cooker before, don't worry. I had neither until I started washing yeast. The key thing is you don't submerge the jars when we put them in, and I'll show you how we do that in a sec. We just use something to sit them on, just like these egg rings, and I'll show you how that works. And we just put a bit of water at the bottom, lids on finger tight, and let it do its thing for 15 or 20 minutes under pressure. And then you just let it cool naturally, you don't rush it. So let's get in and put this together. So we'll take our lid off and we'll put our 4 egg rings, and I'll just slide you over. We're just going to come in and put our 4 egg rings in the bottom of the pressure cooker there, and come in and top that up with enough water so that it's just touching the base of those egg rings there. From there, we'll fill up our mason jars. Now, when we fill our mason jars, we want them filled up to the 300ml mark and leave a little bit of headspace. So I'll do that. Now, when you fill your jars up, you can see I filled mine up to the 300ml mark. I've left a bit of a gap, and that's important because this is going to expand by about 4% when it gets hot. And we just want the lids on just finger tight. So you want the steam to be able to escape, any pressure to be able to escape. And then as it cools, it's going to form a vacuum and leave us with sterile water inside our jars. All right, so let's get our jars in. And you want to arrange them so that they're just sitting on top of those egg rings. And our last one there. Looking good. From there, we'll put our lid on. Those are a bit fiddly till you know how. Make sure it's locked in. Make sure that our relief valve's turned off. And then we'll come down and turn on our pressure cooker. Now, of course, yours may be different to mine. Mine's a Russell Hobbs. I don't know what model it is. I picked it up cheap when it was on special at Big W. All right, so we're going to go manual, and we're going to dial it in for 20 minutes. And with this one, there's no start button. Once it's there, you just let it do its thing. We'll come up and we'll make sure that it's actually going to seal for us. While this is heating up, let's have a quick look under the microscope to see what's actually floating around in the water. I was pretty surprised the first time I checked mine, and you can spot the spores and other bits in there. Now, most of them won't hurt you, but they can mess with your beer and cause contamination. That's why we hit it for 15 minutes at least at 15 psi, just to be safe and make sure that it actually is sterile. All right, so some do's and don'ts. If you've never used one of these before, I know I'm going to have to hand in my man card by saying this. Go and read the instructions. They're probably in the drawer with your significant other keeps all that sort of stuff. Rifle through and go and have a look, have a bit of a read. All right, don't overfill the pressure cooker. You stay to the maximum fill line and no more than 2/3 full. And don't open the lid until the pressure's fully released. It's a huge safety hazard. Don't leave it unattended, especially when it's coming up to pressure. That's the most active phase. And don't force cool it. With cold water or any fast pressure release, when sterilising your jars, because they can crack and explode. That's why it's important that we start off with room temperature everything to allow those jars to come up to temperature really gently. Don't use damaged jars or containers, and avoid anything plastic going inside this because you'll just melt the hell out of it. A pressure cooker is basically a budget-friendly homebrew autoclave. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, and if you run it at 15 psi for 15 minutes, or you hit about 121 degrees Celsius, that's the gold standard for sterilisation. It kills spores, bacteria, and wild yeast, just like an autoclave would. So for a home brewer or someone just getting into a lab-style gear prep at home, a pressure cooker gets you 90% of the result for a fraction of the price. You can see this is just starting to come up and seal now.
You're a wizard, Harry.
There we are. Now we just wait for the pressure to build up inside our pressure cooker and we're good to go. Set a timer for 15 minutes. Cool, so now that's finished. We can see that we hit cancel, keep warm. So the last thing you want to do is rapidly decompress this by releasing the pressure, because what that'll do is it can cause excess strain on our glass jars inside here. So we just let it cool down naturally, and once our safety valve's dropped, we'll come back and open it up and see how we've gone.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
Right, so it's been about 30 minutes. This has cooled down enough so that we can open the lid. Now when we open the lid, we want to open it so that it's away from you. Like that. We'll get rid of this lid. Now, you can see our jars in here. We're just going to lift them out with our handy dandy grabber and come in and pull them out. And that's what we should end up with just there. Now we're just going to let them cool down naturally, down to room temperature. And you can see these tops have already popped in and they've created that vacuum as this water's cooled down. Now it's important that we don't put our jars on the bench directly, because what that can do is that can cause these jars to crack because they'll cool down too rapidly. So a nice little trivet like this one, a couple of bucks at IKEA, I think this one was, and it'll allow the air to get underneath and avoid your jars cracking when they contact the bench. We're just going to leave them there for now. If you look, you can see the level of those jars. Now we filled it up to 300 mils, but as it's heated up, it's expanded. That's why it's important to leave that little gap. And you can see there that they're still sitting at about 85 degrees.
2 hours later.
So it's been about 2 hours. Let's have a look and see how we've gone. You can see that that's sitting at about 35 and a half. Now what we're going to do is just pop these guys into the fridge, let them come down to the same temperature as what our yeast's sitting at in our fridge that's cold crashing. Now this is where things can go sideways while you're doing this. So we want to treat it like a mini lab. So that means no airflow, no fans on, just you and the yeast. What we're going to do is come in and spray down our work area with that bleach solution. Gloves on, we're going to spray down our gloves. And if the whole place smells like a swimming pool, you're doing it right. So I've just pulled our fermenter out of the fermentation chamber, and I'll bring you up so you can see it properly. All right, so we're going to come in with our bleach spray again and cover everything. Be generous with it, so we want to let it sit for a minute or two. While that's sitting, we're going to depressurise this fermenter. So once we're all depressurised, we're going to remove this ring and get ready to lift this lid off. Now there's a trick that I've learnt with these. And what you can do is come in with your tap spanner and just put it underneath one of the posts and just push down and it'll pop up. So we just push up on either side, just progressively back that ring. Now there's no rush for this. We're going to be as quick as we can though. I'm just going to reach in and grab hold of that wrap pill in there. Just get this lid out of the way. There we go. And that way we're not going to damage our wrap pill. And you can see it's covered in nice tube. And more importantly, we're not going to scratch our fermenter with this thing swirling around. Get that out of the way. Now into here, we're going to pop the seal on our first mason jar, and they can be a little bit tough. And that's our first one. And we're just going to dump it into our fermenter. Put the lid back on and just sit him to one side. And now it's important that our water is the same temperature as the yeast because we don't want to shock it. We'll do the same thing with our next kilner jar. To break these seals, if you've got a bar blade handle, you can just push it up underneath here and pry open the lid. And we're going to empty our second jar in. Lid back on our mason jar. And from there, we're just going to push this seal down and gently swirl this fermenter around to get the yeast in the bottom there, all up in solution. We're just going to open that first mason jar up, lid off, and we're just going to tip our yeast in and fill up that first mason jar. Lid back on. That one's good to go. And we're going to do the same with our second mason jar. Again, lid back on. Now we'll just put the rings back on, the locking rings back on our mason jars themselves. Righto, now we're going to wait about 20 or 30 minutes until you can see the tube down the bottom, and you'll end up with a nice clean layer of yeast.
Much later.
Righto, so I've just pulled our two mason jars out of the fridge. You can see there's a difference in colour there. That's all the tube and stuff that we want to separate. So with our third mason jar, I'll just move that one out of the way. So we're going to pop open this one. We're going to discard that water and then decant the fresh yeast off the top of that tube. Now to do that, again, in with our bleach spray, we want to spray the bench, spray our hands, and basically anything that's going to come into contact with this jar itself. Now to open these mason jars, I'll just come around. I'm just going to get underneath it with a bar blade. Let's get rid of that. We don't need that. And we're just going to decant very carefully that yeast off the top. about there. And we'll do the same with this jar here. Just very carefully decant that off. And come in and put our lid back on. And our locking ring on that jar. Now, you can't use normal water, and you notice that I filled it all the way to the top because it contains oxygen, and we want to minimise the exposure to oxygen, because if we let the yeast get exposed to oxygen, it can start using its glycogen reserves, and that reduces the overall yeast viability. So this one will go back in the fridge, and we'll give it a rinse tomorrow.
The next morning.
So this one's been sitting in the fridge overnight. You can see we've got a nice layer of clean yeast here. There's no tube. And all this spent beer and water will get decanted off before we pitch this into our next batch of beer. We'll try and decant off the end of the 100 ml mark and then swirl it up and pitch it just like we would a liquid yeast. Just because we can, we'll have a look under the microscope and see how we've gone. And you can see there's a whole stack of yeast and they're all really healthy. I'm not going to get into how to do a methane blue dye test. That's for another video, much later. If you want to see how I brewed the Anzac biscuit ale that this yeast came from, I'll chuck a link up here somewhere for you. If this video has helped you out, give it a thumbs up. It lets me know that I'm on the right track. If you've got questions or tips of your own, put them in the comments below. I read every single one of them. And if you're keen for more homebrew, no fluff videos, hit that subscribe button and ring the little bell icon. It lets you know when I've got a new video ready for you. Look, I'll catch you on the next one. And remember, life's too short not to save a few bucks and to drink dodgy beers. Cheers. Oh, just gets better.